So you heard Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, say the U.S. will be relentless until Iran complies with the 12 demands, basically, the United States put on them. What is Israel's reaction today? Are we where we need to be? Are you concerned about the exemptions? Did we soften the blow a little bit?
We welcome the sanctions. It's working. We see Iran panicking, now blaming the U.S. for acting irresponsibly, blaming Israel. We see the economy shrinking. So this is the right direction to change the reality in Iran. I think it's important to apply more pressure. It is for the U.S. administration to decide about the waivers. Those are temporary waivers. And I think overall, we see major companies pulling out of Iran. Some of the European government, David, are trying to convince the companies to stay and work with the Iranians. But it's not working for them. The companies are smarter than the governments. And major airlines, Air France, British Airways, Total, Volvo, major companies are pulling out from Iran. And I think we will see more and more business coming out of Iran. It is very important.
How long can these sanctions remain in place and remain effective? Because in the history of sanctions, they tend to decay over time. We saw it, for example, in Iraq. It decays over time. And people find out ways to get around them, whether it's China or Russia or someone else. They figure out some other way to get around it. Are you concerned that if the Iranians don't capitulate in the reasonably near future, that they may actually decay?
It depends on the determination of the U.S. leadership. And as of now, we are grateful for the determination of President Trump, Secretary Pompeo. Only yesterday, I met Mr. Bolton, the National Security Advisor, and he was very determined about it. So if they will continue with the determination, it will be effective.
At the same time, if you compare this with what the Obama administration imposed in terms of sanctions, at this point on the track, at this far in, it's about where it was with the Obama administration. I mean, do you expect this to be radically more painful for Iran than what President Obama imposed?
So we welcomed the sanctions back then. The only mistake was to sign the agreement. We believe that you should have continued with the pressure, with the sanctions, and sign a better agreement, one that will not allow them to conduct the ballistic missile test, will not allow them to fund terrorism around the globe. We just heard what they are doing in Denmark, in France, not only in the Middle East, and also the issue of the sunset clause in the agreement. So we believe it was a mistake. So we think if now you will apply the sanctions again, you will bring them to a point that they will have no choice but to open the agreement, and then you need to come up and negotiate a better deal.
So the Iranians have been very adamant that they do not want to give up their nuclear program in perpetuity. I mean, this one had them suspended, but one of the issues, as I understand it, is we want you to agree never to have a nuclear program. If, in fact, there's some relief of the pressure on Iran, where will it come from? Who will help them cheat? Because that's really the experience with sanctions. People start to cheat.
Well, you know, so far it's not about cheating. Unfortunately, some of the government in Europe are saying publicly, we do not believe in the sanctions. They are publicly finding ways to bypass the sanctions. So we are not in a position yet that you actually have to cheat. I think it will take more time to bring them on board. And I think it's very interesting, and nobody actually spoke about it. But look at those countries who support the Iranian regime, and look where the Iranians are planning their terror attacks. In France, in Denmark, in those countries. And also I saw a picture of the Iranians burning the American flag, the Israeli flag, but also the British flag. So it's very dynamic, and I think those countries will eventually join the U.S.
Everything's connected to everything in the Middle East, and we had this terrible event involving Mr. Khashoggi, the journalist in Turkey, but a Saudi Arabian. And again, your prime minister over the weekend came out and condemned it, but said at the same time, we need relations with Saudi Arabia as a practical matter for stability in the region. How will that play out? Does that weaken Saudi Arabia, the way they've been really ostracized around the world, to a degree that really helps Iran, ironically?
David, first of all, I'm used at the UN that they blame Israel for everything. So far, nobody blamed us for this crime that took place in Turkey. Prime Minister Netanyahu was very clear about it. It was a horrendous attack, and he condemned it. But when we look at the global threat to the region, it is not the Saudis, it's the Iranians. They are the one who are deploying thousands of militants into Syria. They are the one who are funding Hezbollah, Hamas, and all the terrorist organizations in the regions. So for us, Iran is the problem, not the Saudis.
But what about the war in Yemen? Isn't that a threat to the region? I mean, there's really a tragic situation there that seems not to be getting better. It's getting worse, with, to some extent, U.S. assistance in the form of war material.
it is a problem because that's the new way of action of the Iranian regime, is to use proxies. So they use proxies in Yemen, they use proxies in Lebanon, and now they are trying to build another force on the Golan Heights next to our border, and we are very determined not to allow it. We will stop them from building another force in Syria in order to attack Israel in the future.
A week ago Saturday, we had a tragic event in Pittsburgh involving a synagogue called Tree of Life with people shot because of anti-Semitism, apparently. Anti-Semitism is not just limited to this country. We're seeing it in Europe and other places. But as you look at this administration, the Trump administration, which, as you say, has really been helpful to Israel in various respects, are they doing enough to decry anti-Semitism in this world? I'm not saying they're behind it, but are they really doing enough to discourage it?
Anti-Semitism is on the rise. That's a fact. We see it in Europe, we see it here in the US. President Trump was very clear about denouncing the attack, denouncing anti-Semitism, and we think it's important. But I think we should speak about the future. I think we should speak about adding security to synagogues also here in the US, not only in Europe, and also the issue of social media. Freedom of speech is very important, but you cannot allow it to become freedom of hate. In Israel, we monitor social media of potential terrorists, and we are able to prevent many attacks. I think also here, you will have to find the way, the legal, ethical way, to monitor those hate websites and prevent the future crime.
There's been a great spirit and tradition of cooperation and security issues between the United States and Israel. To the best of your knowledge, is the United States reaching out to Israel and learning from your experience on things like social media? Because there's a lot of concern, even with the elections tomorrow, that we are not properly protected against cyber interference.
We cooperate with the US, we share technology and innovation with our allies, and we are happy to do it. And also, unfortunately, we have hands-on experience dealing with terrorists and anti-Semites, but the responsibility to protect the Jewish community here in the US is for the authority to do, not for the Israelis.